They called it a kingdom of rain and fog, a small island adrift at the edge of the world. Yet from its shores would rise an empire so vast that the sun itself seemed to follow its march across the globe. Sit back, relax, and imagine the hum of the North Sea against the stone cliffs of Dover, the echo of church bells rolling through mist, and the faint scent of coal, the fuel of a nation that would soon command the winds and the waves. Britain, once a modest island realm, looked outward, not with armies at first, but with sails, great white canvases that caught the restless breath of destiny. The story of the British Empire is not merely a tale of conquest. It is a story of curiosity, ambition, arrogance, and contradiction of a people who believed they carried civilization in one hand and profit in the other. From the spice-scented coasts of India to the cold frontiers of Canada, from the sugar fields of the Caribbean to the deserts of Africa, the red stain of empire crept across maps until nearly a quarter of the planet bore its mark. But every empire begins with a spark, a moment when imagination turns into intention. For Britain, that spark began in the age of wooden ships and restless minds. Merchants dreamed of fortunes, monarchs hungered for power, and explorers whispered of lands beyond the horizon. Yet beneath their ambitions ran something deeper, the quiet, unspoken belief that they were chosen to rule, guided by divine purpose, by commerce, or simply by the tides of history. Some say it began as a search for trade. Others suggest it was survival, a small island seeking resources it could not find at home. Whatever the reason, by the early 1600s, English ships were already sailing toward distant worlds, laying the first fragile threads of a network that would soon strangle distance itself. What began as trade became dominance. What began as exploration became empire. But every beginning hides a shadow, and as Britain's reach grew, so too did the questions it could never quite silence. Was this progress or plunder? Was it faith or greed? As the mist clears and the sails unfurl, we begin a journey across centuries, through the rise, the power, and the unraveling of the British Empire. And in the heart of it all lies a haunting question. How did one small island come to rule the world? Before Britain commanded oceans, it first had to command itself. The 16th century was a restless age. Kings were deposed, queens were crowned, and the island trembled with ambition. The Tudor monarchs, from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, reshaped England's destiny with fire and fear. The church broke from Rome, monasteries were stripped bare, and power shifted from divine decree to royal will. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected grew, a hunger for horizons. The merchants of London began to dream not of gold in English fields, but of spices in distant ports, silks in the east, and sugar in lands whispered of across the Atlantic. Small wooden ships like the Golden Hind and the Matthew set sail, crewed by men who knew they might never return. The sea became their frontier, the wind their weapon. The Spanish and Portuguese had already carved the world between them, their flags fluttering across continents, but Britain was not content to be left behind. Privateers like Francis Drake and John Hawkins were called heroes at home and pirates abroad. They attacked Spanish ships, raided Caribbean ports, and returned with holds heavy with silver and slaves. Behind every act of exploration lurked ambition dressed as adventure. Yet it was Queen Elizabeth I who gave that ambition its blessing, granting charters to trading companies that would soon grow more powerful than kings. The East India Company was born in 1600, its mission simple: trade. But trade was never just trade. It was control, wrapped in contracts, sealed in blood. As English merchants planted flags on foreign soil, they carried with them not just goods, but systems, language, law, and a peculiar sense of destiny. Some historians say these early voyages were the first breaths of empire, fragile and uncertain. Others suggest they were accidents of fortune, driven not by grand design, but by greed and necessity. Whatever the truth, these small beginnings would soon spiral into a global network that touched every shore and reshaped every life it met. The empire's foundation was not laid in marble, but in commerce, in the quiet signing of agreements, in the rustle of parchment, in the clinking of coins in a London counting house. And yet, beneath this rising order, shadows stirred. The sea brought wealth, but also something darker: slavery, exploitation, and the illusion that power could last forever. From the decks of creaking ships, a new world was being born, one that would make Britain rich beyond measure, and haunted by its own creation. By the dawn of the 17th century, England's ambitions no longer ended at its shores. The winds carried its ships westward across the Atlantic, toward a vast untamed continent that would become both its prize and its burden: America. Sit back for a moment and picture it. Forests stretching beyond imagination, rivers running wild and unclaimed, the distant hum of native drums beneath the whisper of the trees. Here, in this place of promise and peril, the English began to build their first overseas colonies. Jamestown in 1607, fragile, starving, clinging to survival. It was less a city than a prayer, and yet it became the cornerstone of a new empire. In these early settlements, dreams collided with disease, famine, and conflict. The settlers brought tools and faith, but also arrogance and fire. They called it the New World, yet for the people who already lived there, it was the end of an old one. Still, the British flag began to spread, first across the American coastline, then toward the Caribbean, where the air was heavy with the scent of sugar and death. The sugar plantations of Barbados and Jamaica became gold mines, but their wealth flowed from chains. Ships sailed from Africa laden with human cargo, each voyage a floating graveyard. The triangle of trade, slaves, sugar, and rum, filled British coffers and fueled its rise. To London's merchants, the empire was becoming a machine, vast, efficient, and merciless. Yet conquest was not limited to the west, eastward. The British East India Company dug its roots into the rich soil of India, where silk shimmered, spices burned, and kingdoms fell under quiet agreements and sharp steel. Soldiers, traders, and missionaries arrived together, one carrying rifles, one ledgers, one the cross. Some historians describe this period as Britain's adolescence, reckless, hungry, unrestrained. Others call it the empire's crucible, the moment when commerce turned to dominion and trade became rule. Across continents, the Union Jack began to fly over forts and harbors, symbolizing both order and oppression. London grew fat on the riches of the world: tea, tobacco, cotton, gold, all flowing through its docks. But every empire writes its triumphs in someone else's tears. Beneath the grandeur of expansion lay the slow heartbeat of resistance, whispers of rebellion, flickers of revolt, and the ancient truth that no empire can last forever. For now, though Britain believed it could, the sun was rising on an empire without end. Or so it seemed. By the 18th century, the British Empire stood like a colossus astride the seas. Its ships threaded through every ocean, its merchants filled every market, and its soldiers garrisoned every shore where the red flag flew. London was no longer just a city. It was the heartbeat of a global organism, pulsing with the rhythms of trade and ambition. Yet the blood that fed it ran red with contradiction. Sit back and picture the docks along the Thames, fog rolling low, the smell of salt and coal thick in the air, and the sound of crates being lowered into the holds of ships bound for worlds unseen. Tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Jamaica, cotton from Bengal, all treasures of empire. But between those shipments were the silent echoes of another cargo, human lives. The Atlantic slave trade had become the dark engine of empire, binding Britain's wealth to unimaginable suffering. Some historians call this the empire's necessary evil. Others say it was its original sin. Either way, the profits flowed, and with them came the illusion of destiny fulfilled. Britain began to see itself as chosen, a bringer of civilization, of law, of progress. Missionaries followed the merchants. Flags followed the missionaries. And behind them all came soldiers with muskets gleaming in the tropical sun. Yet, for all its power, the empire was fragile, held together not by justice, but by distance, loyalty, and fear. In the American colonies, whispers of discontent began to grow. Taxation, control, and arrogance festered until, in 1776, the empire's own children turned against it. The American Revolution was a wound, deep, humiliating, and unforgettable. For the first time, the British learned that an empire could bleed. But empires are not known for retreat. Even as it lost America, Britain tightened its grip elsewhere in India, Africa, and the seas that linked them. The Royal Navy expanded, its cannons guarding not just coastlines, but the very idea of empire itself. And yet, beneath the triumphs and treaties, something uneasy stirred. The realization that the empire's foundations rested on exploitation and fear. It was an age of gold and blood, glittering on the surface, rotting beneath. The merchants saw glory. The captives saw chains. And as the sun set over another conquered shore, few could imagine that this golden age was only the beginning of a far darker story, one of rebellion, reform, and reckoning. When the 19th century dawned, the British Empire began to change its skin. The age of sail gave way to the age of steam, and iron became its new heartbeat. The Industrial Revolution did not merely alter Britain, it redefined its empire. The factories of Manchester and Birmingham demanded raw materials, and the empire provided them. Cotton from India, coal from Africa, rubber from Malaya. In return, Britain flooded its colonies with textiles, weapons, and machinery, binding them in an economic web that glittered like progress but choked like a chain. Railroads carved their way through jungles and deserts. Telegraph lines pulsed across oceans, and steamships cut through the waves with mechanical precision, veins and arteries of an empire that called itself modern. Yet beneath this mechanical grandeur, a new cruelty emerged, quieter, bureaucratic, and efficient. Exploitation was no longer the lash on the back, but the contract on the desk. The British justified their dominance with words like order and improvement, believing they were bringing civilization to the dark corners of the world. But those who lived beneath the Union Jack often saw only extraction, hunger, and humiliation. In India, the East India Company ruled not through swords, but ledgers. In Africa, explorers and mapmakers divided entire peoples with lines drawn in candlelight. The empire's reach became total, not just of land, but of mind. English schools taught native children to admire their masters. missionaries rebranded local gods as devils. Historians rewrote time itself to begin and end with the British. London's streets gleamed with wealth built from sweat abroad. The empire's new citizens, clerks, soldiers, and sailors were fed the myth of greatness, that Britannia ruled the waves by divine right. Yet every empire that believes itself immortal is already dying. The machinery that powered Britain's wealth also powered its downfall. Steam created competition, industry birthed rivals, and ambition spread faster than control could follow. Beneath the facade of global unity, rebellion brewed in sepoy barracks, in African villages, and in the whispers of scholars who began to dream of nations free from the crown. The iron veins that carried Britain's lifeblood were also carrying its poison. Progress had made the empire vast, but it had also made it fragile, a colossus of steel and smoke standing on the trembling ground of its own contradictions. In 1857, the illusion of British invincibility shattered. It began with whispers. Soldiers in the Bengal army refusing to bite cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, a violation of both Hindu and Muslim faiths. But the spark spread like wildfire across the plains of northern India, igniting something far older and deeper than mere offense. It was the rage of a nation humiliated, the cry of a people who had watched their kings dethroned, their traditions mocked, and their land swallowed whole by the East India Company's hunger. What began as mutiny became rebellion. Cities rose in defiance, banners were unfurled in the dust, and for a brief moment, India burned brighter than the empire itself. The British called it the Sepoy Mutiny, a rebellion of soldiers. Indians remember it as the first war of independence. Across the burning fields of Delhi, Lucknow, and Cawnpur, the old world collided with the new. The empire's guns were ruthless, but its fear was greater. For the first time, the British realized they could be overthrown not by kings, but by the very people they had trained to serve them. The reprisals that followed were merciless. Entire villages were razed, rebels were tied to cannons and blown apart, and the rivers ran red with vengeance. But though the rebellion failed, it changed everything. The East India Company, that shadow government of merchants, was dissolved, and the British Crown took direct control of India. Queen Victoria became Empress, and the Raj was born. Yet, under the surface of submission, a silent revolution began to grow in schools, in courts, in the quiet resolve of those who had seen what was possible when fear was set aside. The rebellion had not destroyed the empire, but it had pierced its heart. The British learned to rule with subtler chains, education, bureaucracy, and the illusion of partnership. They rebuilt Delhi with European grandeur, paraded their power through glittering durbars, and declared the empire eternal. But beneath the polished marble of their rule, the memory of fire lingered, a fire that would smolder for decades, until it returned again as the voice of Gandhi, as the march to the sea, as the final undoing of an empire that believed it could rule the human spirit forever. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had become the largest the world had ever seen, a vast mosaic stretching across continents, stitched together by power, pride, and the restless belief that expansion itself was destiny. From the icy edges of Canada to the gold fields of South Africa, from the jungles of Malaya to the deserts of Egypt, the British flag fluttered in every climate, every sky. They said the sun never set on the empire, and it was true somewhere at every hour of the day. The red and blue of the Union Jack caught the light. Yet for all its brilliance, That endless daylight cast long shadows. The empire's reach was sustained not just by military might, but by stories, stories of civilization, duty, and divine mission. The Victorians called it the white man's burden, the moral weight of ruling the uncivilized. It was a justification gilded in hypocrisy, for behind the noble speeches were opium wars, forced labor, and famine. In Ireland, fields lay empty while grain was exported. In India, millions starved as exports rose to feed the empire's cities. The same steamships that carried British ideals also carried stolen goods, from diamonds and ivory to the bodies of indentured workers bound for distant plantations. London grew rich on this flow of extraction, becoming the beating heart of a system that devoured the world and called it progress. But even as Britain declared itself the pinnacle of modern civilization, cracks were forming in the imperial illusion. Colonies were beginning to awaken, not militarily, but intellectually. Local elites, educated in British schools, began to question the very empire that had taught them to read. The seeds of nationalism took root quietly in essays, in speeches, in secret meetings. Meanwhile, at home, the empire's moral certainty began to erode. The cost of ruling half the world weighed heavily on the working class, who saw little of its wealth. The sun might never set, but it began to dim, subtly. For empires, the beginning of decline rarely looks like collapse. It looks like perfection, an empire at its brightest, unaware that the light is already fading, unaware that in the endless glow of conquest, night is already gathering at the edges of the horizon. As the empire reached its glittering zenith, Britain turned conquest into spectacle. The late 19th century was an age of confidence, of parades and pavilions, where the power of empire was displayed not through war but through wonder. In 1851, the Great Exhibition opened in London's Crystal Palace, a colossal structure of glass and iron, shimmering like a temple of progress. Inside, the world was arranged as a museum of empire. Jewels from India, furs from Canada, spices from Ceylon, machines from Manchester, every object whispering the same message, that Britain ruled not only by force, but by genius. The crowds came in millions, awed by the illusion of unity and control. To the British public, it was proof of divine order. To the colonized, it was a mirror of absence. Their cultures stripped of context, their treasures displayed as trophies of subjugation. The empire was not just political, it was psychological. Art, literature, and even science became its accomplices. Maps painted half the world in red, novels romanticized explorers, and anthropology turned living peoples into specimens. The empire was no longer something distant. It had seeped into the imagination, into the very idea of what it meant to be modern. Queen Victoria sat at its center, a symbol of domestic virtue ruling an empire of iron and blood. Yet behind the grandeur, unease grew. Industrial cities darkened with smoke and poverty. The colonies whispered of revolt, and intellectuals began to question the morality of empire itself. But spectacle drowned out discomfort. When the British displayed African warriors or Indian princes in their imperial exhibitions, the public saw diversity, not domination. The illusion was complete. The empire appeared benevolent, enlightened, eternal, and yet, beneath the glass and steel, the air was heavy with contradiction. Those who built the empire were beginning to doubt it. Those who served it were beginning to resist. The exhibitions celebrated a world conquered, but they also revealed the empire's deepest fear, that without expansion it would stagnate, that without control it would unravel. The glass palace of the empire gleamed in the sunlight, but like all glass, it was fragile, transparent, reflective, and destined one day to shatter beneath the weight of the very history it sought to display. As the century turned, the empire began to hum like a living machine. Railways snaked through continents, carving paths across wilderness and kingdoms alike. Steamships connected London to Bombay, Cairo, Hong Kong, and Sydney, turning oceans into highways of trade and command. Telegraph wires pulsed beneath the seas, transmitting orders and markets in seconds, binding distant lands to the same heartbeat. It was the empire's great illusion that control could be total, that distance no longer mattered. In the glow of coal and iron, Britain felt immortal. The Industrial Revolution had not just built cities, it had built dominion. The factories of the Midlands poured smoke into the sky as British goods flooded the world, stamped with the seal of supremacy. Made in Britain became a statement of destiny. In the colonies, railways became symbols of progress, but also of power. They carried soldiers to rebellions, raw materials to ports, and dreams away from those who could not afford the tickets. Each new line drawn across a map was a declaration: this land is ours. And yet, the smoke that filled the empire's lungs was also its slow suffocation. Industry demanded more coal, more cotton, more labor. Mines dug deeper, plantations spread wider, and cities swelled with the displaced. In Africa and Asia, entire economies were re-engineered to serve the metropole. Local crafts died, replaced by imported goods. Ancient rivers were dammed, forests cleared, languages silenced in schools. The empire claimed to civilize, but it mechanized instead, turning life into production, people into data, culture into profit. Still, the age of steam brought its own mythology. The locomotive and the telegraph became symbols of divine progress, proof that Britain's rule was the natural order of modernity. Yet as the empire grew more mechanical, it grew less human. The British believed they had mastered time and distance, but the cost was unseen. The quiet erasure of identity, the dull ache of those who toiled for progress they would never taste. The empire moved faster than ever before, but in its speed, something sacred was lost. And while the world marveled at the marvels of steam and smoke, a question began to whisper in the shadows. Could a machine built on control ever understand the chaos of the human heart? London stood as the empire's beating heart, the grand illusion of order amidst a world of conquest. The city pulsed with wealth, smoke, and secrets. The Thames, carrying whispers from every corner of the globe. Spices from the East, diamonds from Africa, tea from India, all poured into its docks, transforming London into a metropolis that glittered like a crown set on the world's brow. Yet beneath its brilliance lay rot. The same streets that echoed with the steps of merchants and ministers also echoed with hunger and disease. The empire's riches were built on invisible hands, on sweat that never reached the city that consumed it. Still, London presented itself as eternal. Parliament debated the fate of nations while fog rolled through the alleys, cloaking the city in a ghostly calm. The British Museum rose as a temple of stolen wonders, statues of pharaohs, scrolls from Mesopotamia, jewels from India, each artifact a fragment of someone else's story, repurposed to tell Britons. It was here that the empire justified itself, wrapped in scholarship and civility, its violence hidden beneath velvet and marble. The British people, taught from birth to believe in their civilizing mission, saw themselves as guardians of history rather than its thieves. For the good of mankind, they said, even as cultures were dismantled and rewritten in English ink. But London was more than a city. It was a mirror of contradiction. The poor lived in shadows, while aristocrats toasted imperial victories in gaslit halls. Orphans wandered the streets as colonial governors dined on imported luxuries. And yet, through the grime and grandeur, there was a strange unity, a shared belief that Britain's destiny was to rule, that its empire was both burden and blessing. The newspapers called it progress, the poets called it glory, and the factories called it necessity. Every empire needs a heart, but every heart has its limits. As London expanded, so too did its dependence on distant mines, foreign ports, and unseen labourers whose voices echoed faintly through the goods they produced. The empire's strength was real, but it was fragile, a body too vast for its own pulse, a heart that beat for too many others, unaware that one day the flow of its lifeblood would reverse, and the colonies it had drained would rise to reclaim their stories from the marble halls of their captor by the late 19th century. The empire had entered an era of feverish ambition, a global contest known to history as the scramble for Africa. It was a race not of nations seeking discovery, but of empires carving the world into possession. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, diplomats drew straight lines across maps of places they had never seen, dividing rivers, mountains, and tribes as though the land were parchment and its people ink. Britain, already powerful, hungered for more. Africa was not a continent to them. It was a warehouse of resources, a theatre of prestige, a chessboard of imperial rivalry. The explorers who once wandered for curiosity now mapped for conquest. Missionaries followed, carrying Bibles and flags, promising salvation while clearing the way for soldiers. Cecil Rhodes dreamed of painting the map red from Cairo to Cape Town, a continuous chain of British rule. He called it destiny. History would call it greed. Yet the empire moved with calculated precision. Railroads and telegraphs followed wherever the flag was planted. Gold and diamonds flowed north, while men were forced into labor, chained by contracts instead of shackles. Whole societies were dismantled and rebuilt in the British image. The empire did not merely conquer land, it conquered memory. African kings who resisted were erased, replaced by names like protectorate and crown colony. But every domination leaves a wound, and every wound remembers. Beneath the colonial pomp, resentment simmered. The Zulu fought with pride, the Ashanti with cunning, the Sudanese with faith, and though Britain triumphed in battle, each victory carried the taste of blood and forewarning. Meanwhile, at home, the British public consumed tales of adventure and moral duty, blind to the violence that sustained their prosperity. Newspapers spoke of progress, never of plunder. Schoolchildren traced red maps with pride, never knowing the cost. The scramble had given Britain more land than any empire before it, but it had also spread its weaknesses farther than ever. Each new conquest required new control, new resources, new justifications. The empire had reached its peak, but it was now a giant stretched too thin, standing on ground that was no longer firm. And as the 20th century approached, the very territories it had taken in haste would become the places where its undoing began. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood astride the world like a colossus, its red-stained territories stretching across continents and oceans. It was said that the sun never set on it, but what few dared to ask was what happened in the darkness that followed its light. From the gold mines of South Africa to the opium warehouses of India, Every sunrise carried both wealth and warning. London had become the beating heart of the world, a city of smoke and power where telegraph wires hummed with imperial commands. Yet beneath the grandeur of Westminster and the whisper of polished boots on cobblestones, there was a tremor, an unease, born of the sheer size of what Britain controlled. Millions of subjects, hundreds of languages, dozens of faiths, all under one crown. But empires are not sustained by glory alone. They are held together by systems, by fear, by myth. The British called it civilization, but in truth, it was administration, intricate networks of governors, viceroys, and clerks who kept the illusion alive. Railways stitched distant lands to ports, and ships carried the empire's pulse across the seas. Yet every system breeds its shadows. In India, dissent began to move quietly. Educated elites questioned the morality of empire. Poets wrote of stolen dignity, and soldiers remembered the scars of rebellion. In Ireland, nationalism burned under the veneer of loyalty. In Africa, resistance was reborn in whispers, stories, and songs that refused to die. Even in Britain, the empire's moral weight began to press on its conscience. Some writers and thinkers, once proud of its mission, started to see the cracks, the cruelty masked as duty, the exploitation dressed as progress. But to challenge the empire was to challenge identity itself. For Britain's greatness was inseparable from its possessions. It was the age of pageantry and progress, but also the age of denial. The British Empire had reached its zenith, yet its foundation was trembling. Its strength depended on the obedience of millions, and obedience, as history shows, is never eternal. As the world prepared to enter an age of mechanized war and industrial revolution, the empire faced its greatest test, not from foreign rivals, but from within. And in the whispers of rebellion that echoed from India to Africa, the first winds of change began to stir. By 1914, the empire stood on the edge of an abyss it did not yet see. Britain ruled 1/5 of the Earth's surface and 1/4 of its population, yet its confidence masked a growing fragility. The age of conquest had given way to an age of anxiety, beneath the order and ceremony of imperial rule. Cracks had begun to form in colonies restless for self-determination, in Europe where alliances tangled like barbed wire, and in the hearts of a generation about to be consumed by war. The First World War began with parades and promises, but what followed was slaughter on a scale no empire could control. Britain called upon its dominions and colonies, and they answered. From India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand came millions of men who fought and died under a flag that was not their own. In the mud of the Somme and the deserts of Mesopotamia, the empire's subjects bled together, and in that blood a new consciousness was born. They had fought for freedom, and now they began to ask, whose freedom? The war strained Britain's economy and spirit. Factories once devoted to trade became engines of death. Colonies that supplied resources began to demand repayment in rights. The illusion of invincibility dissolved in the trenches. London, the empire's radiant capital, was shadowed by grief and ration lines. When the armistice came, it was not triumph that filled the air, but exhaustion. Yet the empire, though shaken, emerged larger, taking control of former German and Ottoman territories under the guise of mandates. Britain's flag now flew over Baghdad, Jerusalem, and East Africa, but these were prizes that came with hidden costs. Managing such vast and volatile lands required more force, more money, and more justification. The moral tone of empires shifted once again from the language of civilization to the rhetoric of guardianship. But the world had changed. The old order that had sustained empires was dying. Nationalism, socialism, and self-determination, ideas that had once belonged to Europe, were now spreading across the colonies. The very people Britain claimed to guide began to see through the veil. The Great War had not ended the empire, but it had stripped it of its innocence. And as the soldiers returned home, both British and colonial, they carried with them not pride, but questions that would soon demand answers. The years after the Great War were years of uneasy victory. Britain had survived, but at a terrible cost. Its cities were scarred, its economy strained, and its people haunted by loss. Yet even as the empire draped itself in medals and memorials, the true battle was shifting far from the Western Front. Across the colonies, something was awakening, a slow, relentless fire of defiance. In India, the call for independence no longer whispered in drawing rooms. It thundered in the streets. The massacre at Amritsar in 1919, when British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians, shattered any illusion of benevolent rule. The empire's mask slipped, revealing the fear that held it together. Gandhi emerged not as a conqueror, but as a challenger armed with nothing but words and silence. His movement of non-violent satyagraha became more powerful than any army, because it attacked the empire's conscience, not its soldiers. Britain's rulers saw rebellion where there was only dignity, and their attempts to suppress it only deepened the rift. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, new nations rose from the bones of fallen empires, and Britain found itself entangled in promises it could not keep. It had pledged Arab independence, yet divided their lands into zones of influence. Oil, the lifeblood of modern power, began to dictate imperial policy. The empire that once ran on trade now ran on fuel, and its engines demanded more every year. In Africa, resentment smoldered in villages where land had been taken and culture erased. In Ireland, rebellion turned to war, and the island was split by treaty and blood. The British Empire was no longer a symbol of glory. It had become a machine running on borrowed time, held together by paper treaties and moral fatigue. Even at home, the illusion of unity was faltering. Soldiers who had fought for king and country returned to poverty, unemployment, and disillusionment. The empire they had defended was changing, and not in their favor. As the 1920s unfolded, the world began to realize that the old order was dying, but few could imagine what would replace it. For now, the British Empire still stood, vast, proud, and weary, unaware that the next great conflict would not just test its might, but seal its fate. Forever, as the 1930s dawned, the empire stood draped in both pride and fear. The Great Depression had shaken its foundations, revealing the fragile threads that bound its far-flung dominions. Once, trade and industry had been its lifeblood. Now they became its burden. The factories of Manchester and Birmingham slowed. Ships sat idle in London's docks. And across the colonies, markets collapsed. Millions who had once been subjects of the empire's economic machine now felt its cold indifference. Hunger spread, unemployment grew, and trust in the empire's promise began to fade. Yet amidst this uncertainty, Britain still held tightly to its self-image as the world's guiding power. Politicians spoke of resilience. Newspapers printed stories of empire building and progress. And the Union Jack still flew proudly over territories that stretched from Africa to the Pacific. But in the quiet corners of the empire, other flags were beginning to rise. In India, the movement for independence was no longer a dream, it was an inevitability. Crowds gathered in defiance, chanting for freedom, as the British Raj struggled to hold control through reforms that satisfied no one. In Africa, teachers, clerks, and soldiers, educated under British systems, began to question why the equality they were taught did not extend to them. In Palestine, tensions between Arabs and Jews grew under British administration, and promises made during the war came back to haunt the empire. Meanwhile, in Europe, darker clouds gathered. The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, the expansionist ambitions of Japan, and the growing threat of global conflict began to cast a long shadow over Britain's imperial dream. The empire that had once felt eternal now seemed vulnerable, stretched too thin to defend every corner. Military planners in London whispered of the unthinkable, another world war. But even as danger loomed, the empire clung to its illusion of control. Royal tours continued, colonies were told of progress, and the myth of British invincibility persisted in the minds of those who still believed in destiny. Yet beneath the surface, the world had changed. The colonies had tasted their own power, and they would not forget it. The empire's subjects had become its challengers. Its wealth had become its weakness. And as Britain prepared, unknowingly, to face its greatest trial, the winds that once carried its ships across the oceans were beginning to shift, no longer in its favor, but against it. In 1939, the storm broke. Once again, the world was at war, and the British Empire was thrust into a conflict that would determine not only the fate of nations, but the survival of empire itself. Britain stood defiant against Nazi Germany, yet its strength no longer rested solely on the island. It rested on the millions who lived under its flag, soldiers, laborers, sailors, and farmers scattered across the globe. From India came more than 2 million volunteers, the largest volunteer army in history. From Africa came battalions who fought in deserts and jungles far from home. From Canada, Australia, and New Zealand came men and women who crossed oceans to defend an empire already fading. In London, Churchill spoke of fighting on the beaches and never surrendering. But his words drew power from the colonies that supplied food, steel, and blood. The empire became both shield and sword, yet even as it fought for freedom, it ruled by force. In India, the call for independence only grew louder. The Quit India movement erupted, and while Britain claimed to fight tyranny abroad, it imprisoned those who demanded liberty at home. The contradiction was glaring, but necessity silenced debate. The war consumed everything. Bombs rained over British cities, rationed books replaced money, and the empire's resources were drained to keep the war machine alive. In the deserts of North Africa, the Union Jack stood against the swastika. In Burma, British and Indian troops battled the Japanese through unforgiving terrain. The empire's reach was both its power and its curse. It fought on too many fronts, relying on loyalty that could not be guaranteed forever. When victory finally came in 1945, it was not triumph that filled the air, but exhaustion. The empire had survived, but it was changed beyond recognition. The cost of victory was staggering, financially, morally, and politically. Britain was bankrupt, dependent on American loans, and its colonies, once obedient, now saw weakness where they had once seen power. The myth of British invincibility had been broken by war and revealed as human after all. As the smoke cleared and nations rebuilt, the British Empire stood victorious on paper, yet its heart was already hollow. The war had forged freedom in the minds of its subjects, and that freedom, once imagined, could not be forgotten. The end of empire had begun, not with rebellion, but with realization. The years after the Second World War were not a return to glory, but a reckoning. Britain emerged bloodied and broke, its cities scarred, its coffers empty, and its authority questioned from every corner of the empire. The illusion of permanence began to crack, revealing the restless ambition of those who had served, suffered, and sacrificed under its flag. Across Asia and Africa, the call for independence became a roar that no amount of diplomacy or delay could silence. In India, the jewel of the empire, the tide was unstoppable. Gandhi's voice had turned from protest to prophecy, and Nehru's words carried the weight of destiny. Britain, unable to hold a nation that no longer feared its power, chose retreat over ruin. In 1947, the empire's proudest possession was split in two, birthing India and Pakistan in a river of blood and fire. Millions were displaced, thousands were slaughtered, and yet, for all the tragedy, it marked the irreversible unraveling of imperial control. Once India fell away, the rest followed like a chain reaction. Burma, Ceylon, Malaya, one by one, the flags came down. The empire that had stretched over continents was shrinking fast, and though Britain still spoke of commonwealth and partnership, the truth was clear. It no longer ruled, it negotiated. In Africa, whispers of freedom turned to revolt. Kenya burned with the Momo uprising, and in the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah stood before his people declaring that colonial rule was finished. Britain tried to manage the process, to turn empire into friendship, but the momentum was beyond control. Even within the island itself, exhaustion hung heavy. Veterans returned from war to find rations and unemployment. The people who had once cheered conquest now questioned its cost. What good was empire when the mother country could not feed her own? The United States, once a rebellious colony, now dictated the world's economic future, and Britain played the role of loyal junior partner in an American-led order. The imperial dream had become an anachronism, a shadow cast by the past on a world no longer willing to kneel. Yet even as the sun set on its dominions, Britain sought to salvage pride from the wreckage, to tell itself that the end of empire was not defeat, but evolution. But deep down, the truth lingered like a ghost. The empire had ruled the world, and now the world had moved on without it, as the Union Jack was lowered from forts, palaces, and ports around the globe. Britain entered an age of uncomfortable reflection. The world it had once commanded was now a mosaic of new nations, each carrying both the scars and the structures left behind. Railways, courts, parliaments, and schools built in the imperial image remained as monuments to its presence. Yet beneath them flowed resentment, the memory of exploitation and arrogance disguised as civilization. The empire's language endured too, spreading like an invisible web through trade, science, and diplomacy. English became the tongue of ambition, the voice of global exchange, and yet, in its syllables echoed centuries of subjugation. In London, statues of colonial heroes stood unchallenged for decades, but time erodes even stone. By the late 20th century, the empire's legacy had become a battlefield of narratives. Some remembered it as a period of progress and order, others as an age of theft and cruelty. Universities began to question what was once taught as pride. Archives were reopened. Voices long silenced began to speak. From India's independence movement to Jamaica's maroon heritage, from Nigeria's Biafra to Hong Kong's protests, the empire had left behind not silence, but a chorus, dissonant, powerful, and unresolved. And yet, the empire's shadow was not only global, it was domestic. Within Britain itself, the empire's end brought migration. From the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa came people seeking opportunity in the very land that had once ruled theirs. They brought new rhythms, languages, foods, and faiths, reshaping the British identity from within. The empire had returned home in human form, and its former subjects became citizens, even as they faced hostility and exclusion. The myth of purity, of Britain as an island apart, was gone forever. Economically, too, the loss of empire forced reinvention. The old system of resource extraction was replaced by finance, service, and global dependency. The empire had taught Britain how to control the world. Now Britain had to learn how to survive within it. And though the maps no longer showed her dominion painted in red, traces of empire persisted in trade deals, military bases, and royal tours. The British Empire, it seemed, had not entirely vanished. It had only changed shape, shifting from territory to influence, from rule to remembrance. But beneath the quiet diplomacy and polite Commonwealth meetings, one question persisted like a whisper in the corridors of Westminster. Could Britain ever truly let go of the empire? Or had it become the very skeleton of its national identity? In the decades that followed decolonization, Britain attempted to weave the empire's memory into a story of benevolence and progress, crafting a narrative where conquest became guidance and subjugation turned into partnership. Museums filled their halls with treasures from Egypt, India, and Benin, presenting them as world heritage rather than plundered relics. Schoolchildren were taught of the empire as a civilizing force, its sins softened, its glories amplified. Politicians invoked the Commonwealth as proof that empire had not died but evolved, that the relationships forged in domination could somehow be reborn as friendship. Yet outside the polished speeches and ceremonial flags, the illusion began to fray. Former colonies demanded reparations, their voices rising with historical precision and moral fury. The wealth that had flowed into London's banks and estates was now being recalculated. Its human cost tallied in slavery, famine, and cultural erasure. In Caribbean streets and African parliaments, the polite myth of empire's progress was being dismantled piece by piece. Still, in Britain itself, a quiet nostalgia persisted. The empire became a backdrop for films, novels, and television dramas, romanticized as an age of adventure and grandeur. But beneath that soft focus lay unease, an awareness that the same empire had drawn borders that bled, divided nations that still suffered, and extracted lives for the sake of gold, tea, and control. The British psyche carried a strange duality: pride in empire's global reach, shame in its cruelty. It was as though the nation could neither celebrate nor fully repent, trapped in an endless loop of selective memory. The world, however, had moved on. The United States and the Soviet Union had taken the stage Britain once dominated, and later China and Europe joined the performance of global power. What remained of British influence now existed in whispers, intelligence networks, financial centers, diplomatic weight, subtle remnants of an empire that refused to fade completely. Even the monarchy, once the living emblem of imperial might, transformed into a symbol of continuity rather than command, smiling through ceremonies as history moved around it. Yet every coronation, every royal tour, every reference to the Commonwealth stirred echoes of the past. For the empire was not gone, it had been internalized, embedded in identity, education, and culture. It had become less of a structure and more of a myth, one that Britain could not live within, but also could not live without. And so, as the 20th century drew to a close, the empire's ghost remained, not ruling continents anymore, but haunting the national mind, asking silently, what does it mean to have once ruled the world? As the 21st century dawned, the British Empire's story was no longer confined to history books or distant monuments. It lived quietly in the streets of London, Birmingham, and Manchester, in the faces of people whose ancestors had once been ruled from afar. The empire had folded inward, becoming a part of Britain's own bloodstream. Curry shops stood beside pubs, mosques beside cathedrals, and voices from every corner of the former empire filled the air of a nation still learning what it meant to be post-imperial. Yet this new diversity, born from centuries of conquest and migration, came with its own unease. For every celebration of multiculturalism, there lingered an undercurrent of tension, the unspoken question of who truly belonged. Immigration debates, economic anxieties, and the rise of nationalism all seemed to echo from the empire's unresolved past. The wealth that had once flowed to Britain's ports now reversed, with capital, culture, and people from the former colonies shaping the new face of the empire's old heart. The irony was impossible to ignore. The subjects had become citizens, the colonized now co-authors of British identity. But still, the empire persisted in subtler forms, in foreign policy, where Britain clung to its special relationship with America, in trade, where it sought influence through the remnants of the Commonwealth, and in memory, where national pride and denial intertwined like ivy over old stone. Britain spoke often of global leadership, yet much of its global presence was a ghost of empire, a network of soft power built on nostalgia more than necessity. Universities, museums, and media began to question this inheritance more openly, asking whether the empire's glory was ever truly glorious. Protests erupted demanding the return of stolen artifacts. Debates over statues and street names became moral battlegrounds. For some, this reckoning felt like betrayal, an attack on history itself. For others, it was long overdue justice. And through it all, Britain wrestled with an identity crisis centuries in the making. Could a nation that once ruled a quarter of the planet see itself as equal among others? Could it let go of the dream of greatness without losing its sense of self? The empire's boundaries had collapsed, but its influence had only gone underground, surviving not in colonies, but in culture, in law, in habit, and in the quiet conviction that Britain's story still mattered more than most. The empire was gone, but its reflection remained, not on maps, but in mirrors. In the fading light of empire, Britain tried to craft a softer, nobler legacy, something that could soothe the conscience and preserve the illusion of unity. Thus emerged the Commonwealth, a loose web of nations bound not by chains but by choice, or so the story went. It was meant to symbolize continuity without domination, friendship without control. But beneath the speeches and ceremonies, a quiet question lingered. Could an institution born from empire ever truly escape its origin? The Commonwealth's meetings glowed with symbolism. Monarchs shaking hands with presidents, flags of once subjugated lands waving beside the Union Jack, words like cooperation and shared future filling the air. Yet, for many, it was theatre, a performance meant to mask the imbalance that had never really disappeared. Britain still played the elder, still subtly presumed the role of guide, even as its former colonies navigated their own destinies. Trade pacts and aid programs carried the scent of influence. Diplomatic gestures hinted at quiet expectations. In Africa and the Caribbean, resentment mingled with pragmatism. The Commonwealth offered visibility, funding, and symbolic power, but also a reminder of who had written the rules of the game. For Britain, it became a comfort, a way to pretend that the empire had not died but evolved into something benevolent. Politicians spoke of a family of nations, yet history had shown what kind of family it once was. In the modern world, where superpowers shifted and global alliances fractured, the Commonwealth became Britain's echo chamber, a place to feel relevant even as its empire had turned to memory. But the illusion began to wear thin. Younger generations across member states saw little value in colonial nostalgia. Their loyalty was not to the crown, but to the present, to trade with China. Technology from America, partnerships with whoever offered the most. The Commonwealth's relevance waned. Its summits became ceremonies of formality rather than purpose. Even the death of Queen Elizabeth II, long regarded as the living link between Britain and its empire, stirred a reckoning across the former colonies. In Barbados, Jamaica, and beyond, calls for republicanism grew louder. The symbolic crown that once bound millions now felt like a relic of submission. And as Britain looked outward, searching for remnants of its old authority, it faced a bitter truth. The Commonwealth was not an empire reborn, but an empire remembered, a carefully maintained mirage shimmering over the ruins of history. Beautiful from afar, but hollow up close. By the time the 21st century gathered momentum, the British Empire had long ceased to exist in any tangible form. Yet its shadow continued to stretch across the modern world, in laws, borders, languages, and the quiet assumptions of superiority embedded within global systems. It was no longer a political structure, but a presence, a ghost that lingered in the corridors of diplomacy, in the frameworks of international trade, in the very rhythm of English speech that connected continents. Britain had lost its dominions, but it still played the game of influence, a subtle, spectral form of control, now cloaked in cooperation. The empire had learned to haunt rather than rule. Every former colony bore its imprint in some way. The parliamentary systems of India and Canada, the legal codes of Nigeria and Singapore, the railways that still cut through the savannas and valleys of Africa, once built to drain resources rather than connect communities. Britain's fingerprints were everywhere, and in that ubiquity lay both pride and guilt. Even its allies, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, carried fragments of its imperial DNA woven into the machinery of Western power. The world Britain had once conquered now reflected its image back at it, distorted but unmistakable. Yet, within Britain itself, the empire became less a fact than a feeling. Nostalgia repackaged as national identity. Political movements began to invoke its memory, promising a return to greatness, to sovereignty untainted by outside influence. Brexit, in many ways, became the empire's ghost speaking through modern mouths, the yearning to be powerful again, to command rather than compromise. But the world had changed too much to allow it. The sun that had once never set on British dominions now shone on new empires, digital, financial, and industrial, where Britain was but one participant among many. Still, the myth endured. The empire remained a convenient story, one that could be blamed, romanticized, or reinterpreted depending on the need. To the disillusioned, it was a reminder of what had been lost. To the proud, proof of what Britain had once achieved. Yet in truth, it was neither triumph nor tragedy alone. It was a haunting, a vast, invisible structure of memory that refused to fade, shaping every conversation about power, race, and belonging in ways few could see but everyone could feel. The empire's ghost was not dead. It was alive in thought, in identity, in silence. And perhaps that was the most enduring power of all, to rule not through force, but through remembrance. Every empire leaves behind ruins, but not all of them are built from stone. The British Empire's ruins lie buried in debt, displacement, and memory, in lands stripped bare and people reshaped by centuries of command. The wealth that fueled Britain's industrial might was drawn from far beyond its shores. Sugar fields drenched in sweat, diamond mines lit by the flicker of candlelight, spices, cotton, and tea carried across oceans by ships that smelled of salt and blood. The empire's brilliance had always been lit by the suffering of others, but that truth had long been wrapped in the soft fabric of justification. Generations of Britons were told that empire brought civilization, that it educated the savage and built roads for the lost. Yet the cost of those roads was often measured in lives. And the education came with erasure, languages silenced, gods forgotten, histories rewritten to fit the conqueror's tongue. Even now, those costs ripple outward through time. In India, partition's wounds still fester. In Africa, borders drawn by distant pens continue to fracture nations. In the Caribbean, the descendants of slaves still wait for acknowledgement that cannot come wrapped in apology alone. The empire's greatest export was inequality, a structure so vast it outlived its own architects. And within Britain itself, the spoils of conquest divided the classes, enriching the few while leaving the many to toil in factories that depended on colonial goods. The working poor of London and Liverpool shared more with the oppressed abroad than they ever did with their rulers, though few realized it then. The empire had promised glory, but it delivered illusion, a sense of power that belonged to the crown, not the common man. Today, historians and activists peel back the myths, tracing the veins of profit and pain that run from plantation to palace. The numbers are staggering, but the moral weight heavier still. The British Empire had conquered a quarter of the world, but in doing so, it had bound itself to an unpayable debt, one written not in gold, but in ghosts. Every monument, every museum exhibit, every coin minted with a monarch's face carries a residue of that debt. And as Britain walks into the uncertain future, the question it cannot escape remains the same. How does a nation built on empire learn to live without it? And how does it ever hope to repay what it took? By the mid-20th century, the winds that once filled the sails of empire began to turn cold and sharp against Britain's face. Across Africa and Asia, whispers of rebellion became roars of independence. Empires, after all, are living things. They grow, age, and die, and this one had grown too vast, too heavy to sustain its own weight. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would name it plainly in 1960, when he stood before the South African Parliament and declared that the wind of change is blowing through this continent. It was not a threat, but an acknowledgement that history was shifting underfoot. From the Gold Coast to Kenya, from Malaya to Cyprus, Britain's grip was loosening, often not willingly but necessarily. The colonies had learned from their masters, adopting their laws, their language, their tactics of resistance. In Kenya, the Momo uprising erupted like a storm. Met with ruthless repression and the silent burning of records meant to hide the cruelty of empire's final defense. In Rhodesia, the settlers refused to surrender control, igniting a civil war that would last until Zimbabwe was born from ashes. Each independence came at a cost. Some negotiated, others bled for. The British government wrapped its retreat in the language of order and decency, calling it decolonization, but to those who fought for it, it was liberation. The colonial office, that centuries-old engine of global authority, was quietly dismantled in 1966, as if closing a chapter could erase its consequences. And yet, in London, many still believed the empire had ended on good terms, that the subjects had been gently guided to freedom. But in the streets of Nairobi, Kingston, and Delhi, the memories were different. The wind of change was more than politics. It was the turning of the moral tide. Nations once dismissed as primitive were now standing, speaking, demanding their place in a world no longer divided between ruler and ruled. For Britain, this wind carried both relief and reckoning. It freed the empire from the burden of its own creation, but it also stripped away the illusion of benevolence. The empire was ending not in glory, but in necessity, a dying giant bowing before the storm of time. And though its banners fell and its colonies rose, the wind that tore them apart would never truly stop blowing, echoing forever through the corridors of history as the whisper of an empire undone. By 1981, the sun that once refused to set on the British Empire was finally fading into twilight. What remained were fragments, islands, outposts, scattered reminders of a time when the British flag stretched across the map like veins of red ink. The great wave of decolonization had passed, leaving in its wake independent nations struggling to define themselves beyond the empire's shadow. Yet the empire's ghost was not content to rest. In 1982, Argentina's invasion of the Falkland Islands reignited Britain's defiant spirit. The war was short but symbolic, a dying empire proving, if only to itself, that its heart still beat. When the British fleet sailed south, it carried not just soldiers, but echoes of past glory. The victory that followed was celebrated as a reaffirmation of power, a reminder that Britain could still defend what little remained of its dominion. But the triumph was fleeting. The world had moved on. The Commonwealth, once a badge of shared identity, became a loose association of nations bound by history, but not allegiance. Meanwhile, former dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were quietly cutting the final legal threads that tied them to London. Canada's patriation of its constitution in 1982 severed the last vestiges of British authority, and within a few years, the Australia Act and New Zealand's Constitution Act followed. The empire had not just lost its lands, it had lost its children. Then came Hong Kong, the jewel of the East, the last great possession. The 99-year lease on the new territories was nearing its end, and Britain could no longer pretend permanence. Margaret Thatcher, steely and determined, faced China's leadership to negotiate a future neither side truly trusted. The 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration sealed Hong Kong's fate. It would return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 under the promise of one country, two systems. For many, the handover marked the final curtain. As the Union Jack was lowered in the humid Hong Kong night, watched by a somber Prince Charles, the empire's heartbeat slowed to a whisper. The 20th century had seen it rise and fall, conquer and concede. And though it ended not in fire but in formality, the silence that followed was heavy. The British Empire had dissolved, leaving behind not an empty stage but a world forever changed by its performance. Its power was gone, but its imprint remained in borders, in languages, and in the invisible architecture of modern civilization. Even after its fall, the British Empire refused to die completely. Its remnants lingered in laws, in institutions, in the quiet rituals of diplomacy and trade. 14 territories remained under British sovereignty, small yet symbolically immense: Gibraltar, Bermuda, the Falklands, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Montserrat, and others, names scattered like relics of a vanished world. They were rebranded as British Overseas Territories, the last flickers of imperial flame surviving in the modern world. To many, these places were footnotes in history, but to Britain they were memories made tangible, fragments of empire still bearing the crown's mark. Yet even as Britain held on, the meaning of empire was being rewritten. The Commonwealth, now a voluntary association, became a stage where former colonies stood as equals, their flags flying alongside Britain's. Together, they represented over 2 billion people, bound less by loyalty than by language, diplomacy, and shared scars. The British monarch, once emperor of half the world, now stood as a ceremonial figurehead for 15 nations, the United Kingdom and 14 realms scattered across the globe. But beneath the surface of polite speeches and royal visits, there was unease. The empire's moral ledger remained unsettled. Historians began to excavate truths long buried: the systematic destruction of colonial records, the cover-ups of massacres, the shadow economies of exploitation. What had been taught as a story of progress began to unravel into something darker and more complex. In classrooms and public debates, the question shifted: was the empire a civilizing mission or a machine of control? The answer, it seemed, depended on where one stood. To some in Britain, the empire represented innovation and order. To others, it symbolized arrogance and cruelty. In its former colonies, the legacy was equally double-edged. It had brought railways and governance, but also division and dependency. The ghost of the empire lived not just in physical remnants, but in the structure of the modern world, in the English language spoken across continents, in the legal codes that mirrored Westminster, in the cricket matches played under colonial sun. Yet these ghosts were not content to haunt silently. They demanded recognition. The British Empire had vanished as a political power, but its shadow stretched forward through time, into culture, identity, and the uneasy conscience of a nation still learning to live with what it once was. When the empire fell, it did not vanish, it transformed. Its power seeped into systems, economies, and cultures, invisible yet indelible. The English language, once the tongue of merchants and missionaries, became the global voice of business, science, and diplomacy. Today, over 1 billion people speak it, not by choice of heritage, but by consequence of empire. British systems of law, education, and government spread across continents, embedding the Westminster model in countries that had once resisted British rule. Parliaments rose where governors once sat, and courts echoed the same legal principles once used to justify domination. Even in rebellion, the colonies had learned the methods of their masters. Cricket, football, and tennis became more than games. They were cultural threads binding former colonies to their old ruler, played under new flags, but born from the same colonial soil. Yet beneath these shared inheritances lay deeper fractures. The lines the British drew often straight, careless, and indifferent to culture or kinship, cut through tribes, religions, and nations. Those artificial borders still bleed today, from Kashmir to Nigeria. The empire's hand-shaped global migration, displacing millions Indians to East Africa, Chinese to the Caribbean, Irish to Australia, Scots to Canada. The world as we know it was rearranged by British ambition. The railways that link colonies were built for extraction, not connection. The plantations that grew wealth for Britain left famine behind for those who worked them. Industrial Britain thrived on resources stripped from distant lands, its factories burning bright on the fuel of global exploitation. And yet, this is the paradox of empire. It birthed both oppression and order, destruction and development. The very institutions that held power over millions also became the tools by which those same people would claim freedom. Nationalism, legal reform, educational, were shaped within the empire's framework, then turned against it. Today, as nations reflect on their histories, the empire's shadow continues to provoke argument. Was it progress wrapped in cruelty, or cruelty disguised as progress? Some historians call it the engine of modernity. Others, the machine of subjugation. The truth lies somewhere in between, vast, tangled, and unresolved. For in the end, the legacy of the British Empire is not a monument of stone, but a world reordered in its image. A world still wrestling with the consequences of its design, still speaking its language, still walking roads it built, and still haunted by the cost of its power. Time has a way of softening edges, but the memory of empire refuses to fade. In London's grand museums, treasures from across the world rest in glass cases. Masks from Benin, jewels from India, scrolls from Egypt, silent witnesses to centuries of acquisition and displacement. They gleam under soft lights, labeled as artifacts, but their stories whisper of conquest. Every piece carries a memory that cannot be catalogued, a quiet reminder of what was taken and never returned. In Britain itself, the story of empire remains contested ground. Some speak of it with nostalgia, remembering maps painted red and the illusion of global destiny. Others see it as a wound, still open beneath the polished surface of modern pride. Statues of imperial figures stand tall in city squares, their presence now questioned, their legacies debated in protests that echo through the same streets once built by colonial wealth. The memory of empire is not just historically, it's personal. In the children of immigrants who walk through Britain today, the empire's circle closes. The colonized have come to the land of the colonizer, bringing with them languages, faiths, and traditions once deemed inferior. London, once the center of imperial command, is now a mosaic of the very cultures it once ruled. Yet even this diversity carries tension. The debates over immigration, identity, and belonging all trace their roots to the empire's shadow. To forget it would be easier, but impossible. The empire's legacy is written into the architecture of cities, the curriculum of schools, the rhythm of speech, even the food that fills British tables. Each reminder, from the curry house on the corner to the courtroom modelled on colonial law, is a fragment of memory hiding in plain sight. Around the world, former colonies grapple with the same ghost, whether to preserve, reject, or reinterpret what the empire left behind. For some, British influence brought structure. For others, it brought chains. Memory, like empire, is a contested territory. The more one digs, the less clear the boundaries become. What remains certain is that the British Empire did not end with its last. Flag lowered, it survived in the stories told and untold, in the silence between generations, in the question that never seems to fade: can the memory of empire ever be separated from the identity it helped create? Or is it now forever part of the world's collective shadow? Though the British Empire dissolved in name, its skeleton still stands beneath the skin of the modern world, invisible yet undeniable. The mechanisms of control, finance, trade, language did not vanish when colonies declared independence. They merely changed form, adapted, and continued under the banners of diplomacy, globalization, and cooperation. Former colonies, now sovereign nations, still operate within systems designed by their old rulers, English as the language of power, British-style parliaments echoing Westminster economic models bound to Western markets. The empire became less visible but more pervasive, its reach extending through institutions rather than armies. The City of London, once the empire's financial heart, remains the quiet governor of global capital, directing wealth and debt with the same cold efficiency that once managed colonies. Multinational corporations, many born in the age of empire, now play the role of modern imperialists, extracting resources, dictating policy, shaping destinies of nations under the guise of development. The empire's flags may have been lowered, but its influence flows through data cables, shipping routes, and stock exchanges. It survives in the Commonwealth, that strange alliance of former colonies tied to the memory of a crown that no longer rules them, bound not by loyalty but by the lingering gravity of history. Even culture carries the echo. British accents dominate global media. British education remains a measure of prestige, and British systems of law govern half the world's courts. The empire never truly died. It dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization, diffused and untraceable, yet essential to the world order it created. Its ghost walks, not in red uniforms, but in boardrooms, treaties, and the quiet normalization of inequality masked as progress. To many, this is the empire's final victory, not in conquest, but in permanence. Its ideologies of hierarchy and control became invisible norms, its boundaries redrawn in the invisible lines of trade, its authority rebranded as civilization itself. The empire, in its modern form, does not need armies or flags. It has become a state of mind, a structure so deeply embedded that those living within it rarely see its shape. The sun no longer rises and sets on British soil, but the empire's light, refracted and disguised, still burns across the world, quiet, enduring presence that proves that empires, once built on blood and power, can outlive even the memory of their own demise. As we reach the final chapter, one question lingers like the smoke of forgotten gunfire. What does it mean to inherit the legacy of empire? For those who once ruled, there is pride mingled with guilt, nostalgia wrapped in denial. For those who were ruled, there is pain, memory, and the endless work of rebuilding what was taken. The British Empire may have ended, but its shadow stretches across continents and centuries, shaping identities, languages, borders, and beliefs. Its roads carved paths through jungles and deserts, but also through minds teaching, some to see themselves as rulers and others as subjects. Even now, monuments of empire stand tall in cities like London, silent but defiant, symbols of triumph to some and oppression to others. Every stone tells two stories, one of glory, one of grief. Historians argue over what the empire truly was: a civilizing mission, an act of theft, a necessity of progress, or simply the inevitable consequence of power unchecked. But perhaps the truth lies in its contradictions. It built railways and broke nations. It spread knowledge and extinguished cultures. It spoke of freedom while enforcing servitude. That duality remains the most haunting legacy of all. Some say the empire's true strength was not in its cannons or colonies, but in its ability to rewrite the story, to turn domination into destiny, and exploitation into order. Today, the world still speaks the empire's language, follows its systems, and measures success by its standards, unaware that they are living within the very world it imagined centuries ago. But history has a way of remembering, even when we try to forget. Beneath the modern world's glass towers and digital empires lies a foundation of conquest and control, echoing the rhythms of the old imperial machine. The British Empire was more than a political project, it was an idea, an experiment in global order whose effects ripple through time. Its legacy is not simply written in books or maps, but in the way we think about civilization, progress, and power. So, as the story closes, perhaps the empire's true end is not in its fall, but in our recognition of what it left behind. Sit back, take one last breath of that fading imperial wind, and listen closely. You may still hear it whisper, faint but eternal. Through the corridors of history, the empire is gone, but the world it made still remains.